So, here we go. We're going to have an introduction, and then second lecture we'll start on the principles of creation. So hopefully this gives you a feel for why it's good to study like this. I've no doubt at all that by the end of the week we'll really feel that together. In fact, even hopefully by the end of the day, that there's lots of insight coming. That always happens. And of course it's created by the fact that you're here and you've made a big effort to be here. And God is a living God and is aware of that, so very appreciative of your effort. And will therefore, I'm sure, say a lot of things that will be of specific value to all of us. I just want to start with this overview. A lot of words on the screen now, but don't worry too much about all the words. It's just I want to give an overview at the beginning so you know the journey we're on, in a sense, from the start. Because if you just listen to one bit without knowing where it's leading to and what comes after it and where that bit has its place, it's sometimes possible, as we say in English, to not see the wood for the trees. Do you know that expression? There's a wood, but you can't see it because you're looking at a particular tree. Do you understand? So it's good to have a bird's eye view of the whole wood, the whole situation. I sometimes liken it to being on the underground railway in London. If you don't know London, you can go down in the underground and you just pop up in places, but you have no idea really how it all links together. But if you have an overview of the whole city, then you know. So it's good to have an overview. So we're going to speak a lot at the beginning about, I've used this analogy about health in this little overview. And it's saying what we're going to study at the outset is about what good health is. In other words, we're going to look at God's original motivation and purpose for creating, and the fundamental principles through the application of which the world that God intended could become a reality. And we're going to focus in on the fact that the world isn't as God wished it to be is largely down to a human failure. So this will be actually very insightful. But essentially we want to study about what it is, using the analogy, to be healthy, because if you don't know what it is to be healthy and you're sick, but you don't know what health is, it's very difficult to direct yourself back towards health. So we'll talk about a lot of ideals, or we'll talk about how life ought to be, and you'll immediately notice that it's very difficult to make life like that. So some people hear that bit and they think, this is so idealistic, it's almost not relevant, because I'm not like that, and the world isn't like that, and life isn't like that, and families aren't like that, and so on and so on and so on. And yes, of course, that's true. That's very much the point of the second part. We look at the fact that things are not as they ought to be. In other words, we're not healthy, we're sick in some ways. So we're going to address how that's happened, why that's happened. But of course, if you want to get healthy again, you need to identify the cause of the sickness, but then you also need to know what you're heading towards. What is the goal? How will we head for improvement? Because a lot of times, if life isn't working, if life isn't happy, what do? Just suffer, of course. Now, most people would make some sort of effort to try and find happiness somehow, make it better. But of course, if you don't know if you're moving the right direction towards something which will make you lastingly happy, then you might move in the wrong direction. So a lot of people have experiences in life of being unhappy. They do something to get less unhappy, but they find themselves getting more unhappy. So in other words, how can we identify the direction back towards where we want to go, which is this one. So health, the cause of the sickness, and of course finally the cure. How we're going to correct everything. So there's a lot more detail there, but basically I just want to mention those points. So don't be disturbed when, especially today, we look only at ideals in a sense. We need to know it because you need to know what is health, right? So if you didn't know what your temperature should be, if you didn't know what your blood pressure would be, you wouldn't know where you were, you wouldn't know how to head back, you wouldn't know when you were healthy, you wouldn't know the target. This sorts of points. So is that okay at the beginning? So we're going to cover these, broadly speaking, we're going to cover these 3 sections during the course of the week. In fact, in some sense, even in the first 2 days, we'll look at this, this, and this, and then we'll expand on that. So we're going to have our focus there. So next slide. Why study the divine principle? Well, it's expressing here that, of course, we do want to address the difficulties that we're facing in life. Of course, we could make a much longer list than that one, but we want to address real difficulties that we're facing in our society. Of course, even whether you define them as difficulties or not would depend on your view, right? So people would have very different concepts about what is sexual immorality or morality. They might have very different concepts about drugs and alcohol, or what is criminal and what is not criminal, or they might have very different ideas about what the family is or whatever. So there's already a lot of questions in there in a sense, but we recognize that we're in a world which has a lot of suffering and a lot of difficulty, and we ask ourselves how we're going to address it. The principle's answer is to address it most fundamentally. We need to have information like this. And probably most fundamentally, relates to the first 3. There's a lot of other things which spring from it. But the principle's claim is that because there is a God, and God is the creator and the origin, we cannot understand anything without understanding the creator, without understanding the origin. And we need to understand things like, what is the nature of God? Why did God create? And so on. And only with that very deep insight can we really understand who I am and what my relationship should be with God. And then all these other things spring from that. Then all those answers will address very fundamentally those issues. It's not to say we don't need economic policies or social policies or political answers and so on. Of course we do. Of course we do. We need all sorts of practical things to set the world to rights. But also we need a deeper understanding, so that we've got things in the frame of what's healthy, if you like. Our definition of the frame of what's healthy is, what did God originally purpose and intend, and if we can head towards that. So, what is sexual morality or immorality from God's point of view? What's crime from God's point of view? What's God's point of view on racism? That sort of yes, God's point of view, but if you like, what's the healthy state? How should we be if this world is going to work correctly? And that gets all down to the point as well about very, very deep points. Is there a God? Did God design things well? Is the world suffering under a design fault? You know this idea of a design fault? If something's made, if this computer's made, and in the very design of it there's something faulty, then of course you're never going to be able to make it work, basically, unless you resolve that design fault. But essentially what we're saying is the world is not labouring under a design fault. The design isn't wrong, but actually there's something wrong in our comprehension of God and our relationship with God and our ignorance of the principles which we need to follow in order to realise the world we can realise, the world that God originally intended. Because we'll look at the fact that the problems all arise from our misunderstanding and ignorance of what God originally intended. And then another angle on it, why can't we solve our problems? We've been trying for, millennia, centuries and millennia. Well, actually the answer is here because we don't understand God deeply enough. We don't understand the motivation that lay behind the creation, the purpose of the creation, the purpose of our own existence. And even if we do have some sense for God, we find it difficult to take that sense into the process of resolving our problems. We tend to resolve our problems in just some sort of, more practical approach without deeply resolving profound issues within myself. as my colleague, Mr. Jack Corley, always says, I hope I can remember what he said, having said that. the solution lies in the human heart. That is the heart of the matter, something like that he says. So, we have to resolve something within our core of our own being to resolve everything. And of course, that's got to do with this one. We're rather messed up in ourselves. We're not clear within myself what is my God-given nature and another nature that's at war with it. And that leads us to the next thing, I think. Oh, no, well, anyhow, this is on the way to the next thing. We all would like to live, of course, a very happy, joyful, peaceful existence. There's no one who would disagree with that. But where does such a world come from? And many people would feel, well, surely, if the United Nations was better, if the government was better, if the education system was better, if the social security system was better, if the economy was better, for goodness sake, the economy, think about it, then, I would be better, life would be better, my family would be better. And they basically look at it more that way round. And of course, that's not irrelevant. I'm not saying that we wouldn't be happier if the economy wasn't better or if the United Nations wasn't functioning in a better way. But fundamentally, the principal's viewpoint is the solutions don't run primarily this way. If you want to look at deeper solutions, they don't come from the world to the nation, society, family, and individual. They rather run the other way round. And of course, this is a very empowering thought, because if the solutions ultimately begin in myself, it means I can do something to change me, and consequently that will have an impact on my family, on the impact on the place I work, the institution I work in or whatever, and then on the society and then on the nation and the world. So we take that type of point of view. So the conclusion is the peaceful world starts from me. And of course we're going to look very particularly at me in terms of the relationship between my thinking, my convictions, my best mind, my truest mind, and my actual behavior, which we call the mind and body relationship. And then we're going to look at the relationship between people, centering on the family and therefore man and woman's relationships. And then we're going to look at the relationship between myself and the world in which I live, particularly myself and things, as it were. So our emphasis is that the solutions rest with me. And we'll come back to that again in a minute. This is direct quotation with a few gaps in it from the introduction to the exposition of the Divine Principle book. It says, everyone is struggling to attain happiness and to avoid misfortune. How then does happiness arise? People feel joy when their desires are fulfilled. The word desire, however, is often not understood in its original sense, because in the present circumstances, our desires tend to pursue evil rather than good. Desires which result in injustice do not emanate from a person's original mind. So we're going to explore this in a big way, but maybe it's an interesting place to start at. It's definitely true everybody would like to be happy. However, it's definitely true that life is not just a continuous experience of happiness. Where does happiness come from? Well, I desire something. If my desire is fulfilled, I'll get happy. But you'll find that sometimes we pursue a desire and actually we find out when we get there that we're not happy after all. That somehow we had a misconception of what would make us happy. More profoundly than that, this is suggesting that we have some desires which actually are not healthy, or it uses the word there, evil. In other words, if we were to follow them, we would actually end up making ourselves sick, as it were. You catch the analogy, don't you? I mean maybe even physically sick, but first of all, we wouldn't be in the right relationship with God, and we wouldn't be in the frame of mind and heart that we need to be. So this is a big issue. So this diagram's sort of exploring it. Very interesting opening statement. The starting point of all problems and the solution of all problems is me. I don't know how you feel about that one. Maybe the starting point of all problems is me. That feels a bit heavy, right? Well, anyhow, I don't think we should feel this is too heavy, because the corollary, the next statement is, therefore, the solution to all the problems is also myself, me. That's extremely hopeful. What it means, I think, is if we're forever blaming the government or God or my wife or my children or my parents or whatever it is, we will not find an awful lot of solutions. They will not be there for us to see. And I think anybody who's been involved in trying to help other people in any sort of caring role realizes that if you want to get people to take a course out of unhappiness towards happiness, the first thing you need to do is empower them to understand about themselves and what they can do differently. All the answers always lie there. But it's not so straightforward, because we talked about desires, right? And don't worry that we're introducing a lot of terms here already, but we're going to look at them in more detail through the lectures. It's just a bit of an introduction. So what we're saying is that we do have a mind, and it calls it there an original mind. It means the mind designed by God, as it were, the mind that we receive from God, my true self. Do you have any feeling for your true self? Do you have that sort of feeling? You're ever in a situation and you want to do something, you have a desire, and you look at your desire and you check it and you say, that's not my true self. That's coming from some other place that's sort of within me, but if I follow it, I'm going to mess up and I will not end up making something good. And then you have another feeling, something comes up within you which is pointing you in a direction which may not be comfortable for your more self-centered mind, and challenge you, should I really take responsibility for that? Is that, really? But, because you're sensitive to what's true in yourself, you realize, oh, that's not easy, but yes, that's what I should be doing. Do you have a sense for that? Those sorts of different aspects you have. So that original mind, it's referring to that one. It's the bit within yourself. It's your inner being that's guiding you to do things. And if you follow that desire, then actually, because it's a good mind, an original mind, then actually you'll end up doing good things, and the outcome will be lastingly good results. Of course, it's a bit more complicated than that, because we live in a very muddled world. So good people don't always get instantly good results, because there's a lot of opposition out there. But essentially, if you persevere in following that sort of mind, good things come out. However, as mentioned in the previous introductory passage from the Divine Principle book, we have another type of mind which has another set of desires, and if we follow them, we do bad things, and we end up in the end deeply regretting what we've done, hurting myself, hurting other people. Even the principle would say hurting God, hurting my true nature. So when I follow this nature, it pains me within this aspect of my being. I feel suffering within my true nature. So maybe you know about that. Maybe you've experienced that. Maybe you have a sense for that. What it means then is that if we are torn between these two minds, it means it's very difficult to lead my life successfully, because I'm a being of contradiction. On one side, I want to be true and committed. Do you know the sort of circumstance? Think of the most important things in your life when you decide you really want to do something and you make a very strong commitment to it, but then afterwards it's very difficult to keep it. I've got children who are students at the moment. You want to do really well in university, but actually it's not simple, because you have to discipline yourself. And that means you have to decide to do this instead of that. And in the instant moment, it seems much more attractive to do these things which will not bring any lasting outcomes. And you avoid doing the stuff which is harder to do, and you find yourself, not doing what you meant to do So you're determined, I will get a great result, but it's not easy to do it. Or even more profound, people make commitments to other people. Probably the most profound commitment is something like a marital commitment, for example. We make promises to each other, but it's not easy to keep the promises. So when you made the promises, doesn't mean you were just a liar. You may be extremely sincere, but how do you stick with it and don't allow yourself to behave in some other way that's contrary to your original desire? These are not something that only applies to other people. This is something that applies to all of us. And we're all facing these sorts of things if we're honest about life. And that's a very important matter. So if we're constantly unable to maintain a consistent attitude that belongs to this side, for example, then although we have this good mind and these good desires, we find ourselves doing things which undermine them. And that's a big problem. We become a person of contradiction, and we're suffering from following conflicting purposes in our lives. And this difficulty that's inside the individual, of course, then affects those around them. It affects their family. It affects their work colleagues. It may affect the community and the society. It does, definitely does. It affects the nation. It affects the world. So it spreads from being a problem inside myself. So, I'm probably going to develop, I better be careful. I always have to be so careful because there's so much to say, and I always want to say it at the first shot. But we're going to come back to all these issues, so I don't have to say it all now. So I won't say what I was going to say. I'll move on. You got the idea anyhow, didn't you? Yeah? This is a very important idea, because it means what we're going to look at is relevant to all of us. Because we all have a very good mind. We have a good mind. We have good intentions. We want to achieve ideals and do great things in our lives. But, how do you remain consistently operating out of that sort of mind and heart over time? It's not an easy thing to do. So here we go. Through the course of the presentations, we'll quote from various different scriptures at various points. And I think that's a very valuable thing to do, because I'm wholeheartedly in favor of everybody respecting the great religious scriptures and traditions, because there's huge value and wisdom that resides in them all. So I'm sure we're not all here Buddhists, but here we go. The mind is the forerunner. If one speaks or acts with a wicked mind, suffering follows. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, affection follows. Or very telling statement from St. Paul's letter to the Romans, I do not do the good that I want, but the evil that I do not want is what I do. That's quite a strong statement there. Or, also from Hinduism, the mind is twofold, the pure and also the impure. Or from Native American religion, every person has both a bad heart and a good heart. Anyhow, there are lots and lots and lots of different scriptural references and a recognition of this fact in all the great religious traditions. And essentially it has to do with this issue. It's the issue of how the mind and body relate. So we have the desires of the mind and the desires of the body. That's maybe a little bit simplistic, because what we expressed is that we don't just have one mind, unfortunately. If we just had this really sincere, true, unselfish, original type of mind, of course we wouldn't be suffering a problem. The reality is, though, that we have another mind which is very short-term, self-centered. I want this now for me type of mind, without any concern for other people or the future, right? Then that mind is very careless, very thoughtless, very irresponsible, and it doesn't work in the end. So, but what that sort of mind is actually much more associated with here. So although it's our mind, it's actually quite associated with here. It's associated with quite immediate, more materially, physically orientated satisfactions. Will I stay in bed for another 4 hours, although I'm missing my psychology lectures and probably will never be able to face my exams at the end of the term. You know, what shall I or shan't I? Well, you know I should get up, but actually it's very warm in here. And it's nice, and you know, I had a late night last night, and yeah, anyhow. so that, you know, essentially this is about that true mind, that original mind has desires, and those desires, if we follow them, will lead to us being truly happy about my life, myself, true to myself, true to my best self. And ultimately that implies being true to God and true to higher principles. So that's very, very important. And then we need to get this one in order with that one. In other words, we shouldn't be seeking material happiness in a way that violates spiritual happiness. But that's happening all over the place, all the time in the world in which we live. People are paying little attention to spiritual, ethical, moral principles because they're looking for, you know, material satisfaction and fulfillment. And in doing that, they're actually breaking, disregarding moral and spiritual principles. It doesn't work in the end. In the end, it leads to disaster, personal disaster, family disaster, even global disaster. So, I mean, we're very aware of that something strange is going on in that mysterious world of the economy. You know, something strange is going on in that world that's heading us towards some type of crash or disaster. I just had a phone call conversation yesterday with someone who's coming to our conference. It's the Universal Peace Federation's conference and the Women's Federation's conference in London next weekend. And he's the Greek deputy speaker. We were on the phone, and he wants to come and he wants to speak about the economic crisis and human rights. And his main point is, when you have an economic crisis, who suffers? Who suffers first? Society, yeah, but who's most vulnerable to the economic crisis? Sorry?
The poor, the disadvantaged.
That's right, absolutely right. It's the people at the bottom of the economic structure who are the most vulnerable. They're immediately most instantaneously affected. But of course, they're not, generally speaking, they've got very little to do with what happened behind the scenes that caused the disaster. So of course, this is a huge moral matter, isn't it? But people may think, who are not immediately impacted by the financial crisis, they may feel, well, that's all right then, isn't it? But spiritually, is it all right or not? Do you understand? If your irresponsibility is actually causing misery to thousands of people whose misery you know nothing about and don't give a jot for, do you think you're okay spiritually? Maybe not. Maybe not. And don't you think that might manifest even in your interpersonal relationship? Not just, when you get to the gates of heaven and St. Peter decides whether to open the door to heaven or hell, but, even in your interpersonal relationships. Do you think if you're callous and careless about people generally, do you think you'll be able to be just also completely correct in all your interpersonal relationships or not? Would they have a relationship with one another or not? Anyhow, there's all sorts of questions there. So how to get the right balance between the two is very important. This also has an impact on other matters around our search for, true knowledge. And of course, the principle mentions, this is another interesting point, that in our search for understanding, there's a search for spiritual understanding, which relates to knowledge of God, knowledge of life and its purpose, and also the stages of life. So we're going to look at, is life just this physical life, or is there a life after physical life, and so on. And also, of course, the code of conduct. Issues like what you might call karma, or the consequences of our actions. If you behave against moral and spiritual principles, what outcomes, what results are coming there. That sort of understanding. So no matter where in the world, no matter what time in human history, no matter what culture it was in, everybody's been searching for that type of internal understanding. And essentially the search has been through religion and philosophy. So why have people, bothered about religion and philosophy all down human history in all different places? And actually, extraordinarily, in their search, why fundamentally they've discovered some very similar truths, in all the great traditions. It's because actually we need to know those things in order to be able to work out how to conduct ourselves so that we can be happy on the spiritual level. But also, of course, we need to search for external truths as well. So this relates, which is connected there to the body or the material life and the material world. So they're not without relevance or without importance. Of course, it's very good to know how to cure, how to heal. It's very good to have medical knowledge. It's great, isn't it great that there's advances in, cancer medicine? So people are now beginning to understand how cancer cells operate, and they've got ideas of much more pinpoint treatment instead of chemotherapy that just assaults your whole body. They assault some very specific processes, so you get... Isn't it great? Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it fantastic that we can, grow things better and stronger and so on and so on and so on? So science is good as well, and we need to get the right relationship between the two. That's the principle's point. I suspect that we have a lot more work to do in this area, particularly in terms of our movement, of putting religion and science together. What the principle's saying is these are not in opposition to one another, just as the mind and body are not in opposition to one another. They need to get into the right relationship with one another. And basically the principle's viewpoint is, and we'll look at this more closely later, but you already have a little bit familiarity with the language of the principle, so we say, this is subject, this is object. Or this, this is more internal, and this should shape that. Basically this should follow that. And in a sense, of course, religion cannot answer scientific questions in terms of natural law and the nature of matter, but it should provide a moral direction. And if science doesn't have a moral direction, of course, it can behave very immorally. And we know about that as well. We know that pharmaceutical companies, are they very moral? Don't know. I don't know enough to really make a judgment, but you might wonder, because there's a lot of money in the pharmaceutical industry. And if you invent something, you can make a lot of money out of it. And yet at the same time, it's to do with people's life and death and health, and, it's a sensitive area, isn't it? The morality. If you make something that people need, life or death, and then you can charge them an awful lot of money, and then poor people can never have it. There's all these huge moral issues around that sort of area, obviously. So anyhow, we need religion definitely, because we need to know spiritually, morally, ethically, what's right, what's wrong, what will make lastingly good outcomes, what will restore us to health, what will put us in harmony with God, what will enable us to fulfill what we were designed for, our original purpose. And then, of course, we also need to build our skills and capacities and our ability to use all that's been given to us in this incredible world in which we live correctly, so that we can create a lot of good. But if you get lots of knowledge and your motivation is very poor, your attitude is very bad and very selfish, it would be better you were stupid, because then you wouldn't be able to do so much damage. Those sorts of areas. So we need to get the right harmony. And principle's definitely saying, the divine principle is definitely saying, we need religion and we need science, but they need to be in the right relationship with each other. Here we go. Albert Einstein: science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. So we also, the principle saying, we need a new expression of truth. This is an interesting point. You notice it says we need a new expression of truth. It doesn't say we need a new truth, because of course truth is truth, and always was truth, and always will be truth, and it's going back to the very origin of everything. So truth in that sense is not new. But obviously, as life in our world develops, we're faced with different circumstances. and how to apply truth to our new situation. For example, today, we definitely do not live in, monocultures. Increasingly, we do not live in a world which is my village, my valley, my friends and relatives for the last 20 generations. We no longer live, or 100 generations, or 200 generations. We live in a very multicultural world, don't we? We all mix up with one another. But we're different colours, we're different cultures, we're different religious traditions. So we're facing a new reality. So can you really imagine today, there was just a statement by the, sorry, I'll get into British news. Sorry, you're not all British, I know, excuse me. But we just had a statement. Have you heard of Ireland? It's next door. In Ireland, they had a lot of struggles and difficulties, and some of those struggles and difficulties are characterized as being between Roman Catholics and Protestants. Did you hear about that one? And they killed each other. I mean, the history is all very messy. But in recent decades, there's a lot of difficult feelings. And even now, even though what they called the Troubles are largely resolved, still, particularly in Belfast, the capital, there are many walls. Literal walls, physical walls, which separate one part of the community from the other, because if they weren't separated, they'd be, bombing or throwing stones at or doing nasty things to one another. And also, consequently, the education system is divided into Catholic schools and Protestant schools. I mean, this, to some people today, this sounds almost medieval. Actually, we did it everywhere until maybe 50, 60 years ago. It was like that everywhere between Catholics and Protestants. But when we hear it today, a lot of places we would feel, why do they not want to have to do with one another? This is strange. And it's true, it is strange. And then also you might be in the same college or the same school with someone who's a Hindu or a Muslim and you're a Christian, or you're a Buddhist and they're a Muslim or a Christian or whatever. And of course, they're not going to heaven, or they're never going to reach nirvana, or because they're infidels, or they're non-believers, or they're haram, or whatever it is. They're something, and they can't get there. But actually, when you notice, there's very nice people. I mean, it's when you get to know them, you see, when you first look at them, you think they don't look like me. They're a different color from me. They wear different clothes. They pray in a different way, and I mean, I don't even want to know about them because, they're the non-believers or whatever it is. And as long as you think like that, and as long as you remain in your little bubble, then it's okay, isn't it? But then when you actually get to know them and you find out they're better than you, they've got a nicer family, they're a nicer person, they work harder than you. Doesn't equate, and it doesn't work out anymore. It doesn't seem right anymore. And we're faced with those sorts of realities, aren't we? And we're also faced with the reality that some people in my community are supposed to be better than the other one are doing dreadful things in all communities. And so, we're faced with these sorts of things. So as we face new circumstances, we have to deal with new things. So, of course, the truth should deal with life's questions in as most clear and straightforward and helpful way as possible. Reality is, religious truths, deeper truths, are quite difficult. So if you look at any of the world's great scriptures, it is not an easy read. It is not an easy read. It's many times written in language which is very indirect. It's not boom, it's like indirect. And the more profound it gets, the more difficult it is to understand. And that's why it's remarkable. You speak to some people who believe in the same book, and some of them think it means that, and some of them think it means this. And if you meet the most spiritually mature people from different religions, you find their understanding is very similar, but can be completely different from the people who are, much less deeply comprehending the truth which they're supposedly following. Can you imagine that? I had a little time living in India. It was really interesting, and going and visiting religious leaders and meeting people very different from myself, but finding out that, at core, the people who are most spiritually developed, they have a very similar understanding, even though the scriptures sound a bit different or whatever. It's very interesting. So, in the end, what do we need to discover? We need to discover that at core, the great traditions are guided by God to bring out some very, very similar, at core, some very similar essential understandings. And also, science and religion should not be in conflict with one another. If we really understand more deeply, we'll see, rather than conflicting with each other, we'll understand more what their roles are and how they should relate with each other. And this has to do with the whole issue about mind and body, or the spiritual and the material, and how they relate to each other. And also, when we understand more deeply the truth, it should help us in our interpersonal relationships. So family, international relationships, interracial relationships, and so on. And it should prepare us to fulfill the purpose of our physical lives. And the purpose of our physical lives has a lot to do with the fact that life doesn't finish when we physically die. So that's another interesting and important area. So, we need to understand these things better. And the principal suggestion is this is a progressive process over time. So that's what this diagram is revealing. It's explaining, and again, this is because you already have a bit of familiarity with the divine principle, you'll probably catch the point. The divine principle's point is, had nothing gone wrong in terms of human conduct and responsibility, human beings' destiny was to grow up through a period of personal development and reach a state of maturity or perfection. And in that state of maturity and perfection, they would have, they would have not only comprehended intellectually the truth, they would become a sort of embodiment of truth. In other words, we're going to look in the next lecture about what's the essence of everything, and we find out the essence of everything is something that's deepestly, most invisibly within myself. We call it in the end heart. And it should be the origin of everything. But what does this mean? It means once you've grown up properly, it's not just that you agree with a set of principles, it's rather you've matured in such a way that you, out of your heart, out of the core of your being, you naturally behave correctly without having to look at the book and check what I should do. That's the sort of maturity we're in search of. So you don't have to refer, do you understand? The truth is not coming from outside of you, from a set of instructions. It's coming from within you, from the fact that you've developed a core to your being which is in accordance with love or truth or the right way to behave, that sort of thing. So that's what should happen, but reality is it didn't happen, so we have a lot of very, very immature human beings. They might know a lot of things, they might be great theologians, but actually don't know how to relate to their wife, or how to look after their children, or how to be, a good person. So, therefore, there's a journey of personal development and a journey of historical development. So looking at it in the particular traditions that the divine principle explores, which is basically the biblical traditions and, if you like, the Judeo-Christian line of development. If we look at that line of development, what the principle is saying is Adam didn't grow, or humanity didn't grow to the level of maturity that's expressed there. And in fact, our level of maturity was very poor, very low. And it took, in terms of the biblical account, it took a long time for human beings to become aware of a set of basic rules of living. And this set of basic rules of living applies in all the great traditions, right? So in that tradition, it's the Mosaic law. It's 10 fundamental commandments and a lot more regulations, of course. But that would be true regardless of which tradition you were talking about. You'd find the same elements. So, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, came and he to a society which was unaware of a basic set of fundamental spiritual principles, he brought a fundamental set of principles. And of course, those principles applying to people who don't have any self-control, they're initially applied very, very basic application. But the more people grow through a basic application, the more they become aware of a more and more sophisticated application, a much deeper application. So, when you speak to a very spiritually mature Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, whatever it is, you'll realize that they've taken these basic rules and they've turned them into a very profound understanding of how they should behave. So they don't just think I shouldn't murder, I hate you, at least I should refrain from killing you. They may understand it would be better if not only I don't kill you, but I don't break your arm or make a big lump on your head or punch you in the eye, or even that I don't even hate you. Do you understand? That's much more demanding. So, a development. This is a development of a whole line of spiritual enlightenment through Judeo-Christianity. So we're talking about Jesus coming and further enlightening about things that were already there in the Mosaic Law, which people didn't comprehend so well. And ultimately what the principle's saying is, we're not at the end of the journey. Why are we not at the end of the journey? Because somehow we're not all spiritually mature. And the world is not transformed. So, in other words, we're waiting for another truth. What would this truth do? This truth would do the things that we just talked about. For example, it would need to harmonize the world's great traditions. It would need to help them to respect one another. Because it wouldn't be enough just to respect the Judeo-Christian line. We'd need to respect, because we live in a world now where we're rubbing shoulders with one another. So if I think, just the Bible, everything else is a false heresy, I'm going to have a problem. I'm going to have a problem because that's not true. It's manifestly not true. So that sort of thing. This is true personally then, I'm on a passage of growth and development. Of course, I was already teaching the divine principle 30 years ago, and my understanding has developed since then. But there's another struggle, and that is what about my application? There's not just my understanding, there's my application. How much has that developed? That's, there lies a question. So this is not just intellectual understanding, it's also application. So in other words, even the same truth can be a new truth. So maybe some of you will think, we listened to this divine principle so many times before. But the point is when it comes to you and suddenly you realize that's what it means. That's what it means. I never understood that's what it meant. And it starts to be personally relevant. And because it starts to be personally relevant, you start to change yourself and you find a way to make life work better. That's the sort of, do you understand this point? So we're looking for a new expression of the truth. That new expression of the truth has to deal with the world we live in today, which is a very different world from the world, 1,000, 2,000, 4,000 years ago. And I don't think even today that the truth is easy to grab, but it should be more explicit, more plainly expressed than a lot of scriptural understanding. Here are just some biblical quotations, New Testament quotations about an expectation for the coming of a higher truth. And I'll read one of them. I'll read the first one. This is I have much more to say to you, more than you can now bear, but when he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all truth. This is Jesus. So unification principle or divine principle, what's its claim? Its claim is especially that it's making a big effort to try to bring out very clearly about the nature of God, about the core essential nature of God. And we're going to look at this in the next lecture. And fundamentally, we use this term, heart, to explain about the fundamental nature of God. So if you don't know this about God, you would not know anything about God. And when you say no, of course I know the principle says, because I've been studying the principle, I know the principle says God is a God of heart, right? I know that. But do I know that? Do I really know that? That's another matter, of course. And so we're going to look at that, and we're going to look at that from three very interesting perspectives. We're going to reveal God's heart of creation, and we're going to look at God's heart at the time of the fall, and we're going to look at God's heart in the process of trying to recover it. So this is the same thing I talked about before. This is health, if you like. This is sickness. This is cure. So, God's hopes and expectations and investment in the process of creation with the expectation of only good. And then what impact it had for God when things didn't turn out the way that God intended. And we relate this very profoundly in terms of human experience to parental experience. So nobody, bears children, hopefully. I mean, maybe that's not entirely correct, but fundamentally we want to bear our children in hope. And we have huge hopes for them. And then when it doesn't work out the way we expected, then that's not easy at all. But the parental commitment is such that we commit ourselves to helping to put things right. So the principle brings out this very insightful understanding about God, and it explains many, many things and many, many big questions. How are we doing? 5 minutes. So this divine principle, unification principle, sometimes we call it, is a revealed understanding, revealed to Reverend Samya Moon, our founder. And in one level, it's an intuitive discovery. In other words, he really questioned his own heart and soul, and deeply, deeply questioned in deep prayer over considerable periods of time, and could discover certain things through that process. And also, of course, had spiritual experiences in the spiritual world with people who don't physically live anymore, including the great figures of religious history. And also it combines not just a revelation, in other words, something that came from God, an insight that came from God, but also a rational, a reasonable understanding. And there was a lot of tearful prayer and intense study that lay behind discovering it. So he describes a spiritual battle, basically, to catch that information. He describes his starting point, and we'll talk about that on Friday night. We'll talk about his personal experience, the start of that journey. Those of you who know a little bit about his life already, he was 15 years old by our way of counting it, and he had this very powerful spiritual encounter where he felt he had to make a promise to Jesus that he would devote himself to bringing the world that God wanted to see, and he didn't know how to do it. So he had to start on a whole spiritual process to try and discover the fundamental truths himself, and then to be able to share them with others. And that was the sort of process. So that's him at that time, around shortly after that experience, in his school uniform, under the Japanese occupation. So it's that sort of Japanese school uniform, even though he's a Korean. And this is a lot later, when he's preaching and teaching in Korea, in his probably around about late 30s, 40 years old, something like that. And then this is much more recent. This is 6 years ago, when he was traveling around, starting a much wider level of work for world peace through the Universal Peace Federation with his wife and one of his grandchildren. But he's primarily a spiritual teacher, and feels very, very responsible to God and to humanity, and thinks the greatest service is to share deep religious insight. So he can never stop himself from doing that. Is that it? That must be it. Good. Okay, so that's an introduction. I was surprised I finished early, and then I realized there's this hidden slide. So there were several more slides that I didn't go to. Wow, here it goes. So this is just expressing that there are many different ways, of course, of relating to God, and many different names for God, of which only a few are mentioned here. Here we go. But the principle is absolutely respecting that in all the great traditions there are many insights passed from God down to humanity through various religious founders and scriptures. And what we're actually seeking is a way to draw together and work together for transforming our world out of all the good guidance and good traditions that are there. So this is just a quote from Reverend Samya Moon, from Father Moon, about this point that we shouldn't allow theological difference to divide us. He said this in 1985 at a very large interreligious meeting. Religions should be concerned with God's will for world salvation more than with the salvation of the individual or the welfare of their own denomination. I think that now is the time for all religious bodies together to search again for the true will of God. As far as I know, God is not sectarian. He is not obsessed with minor details of doctrine. We should quickly liberate ourselves from theological conflict, which results from blind attachment to doctrines and rituals, and instead focus on living communication with God. In God's parental heart and His great love, there is no discrimination based on colour or on nationality. There are no barriers between countries or cultural traditions, between East and West or North and South. Through interreligious dialogue and harmony, we should realise one ideal world of peace. So very much that sort of vision of going beyond division and really respecting and trying to understand each other. Of course, reality is there is a big cultural divide, or it's very easy to misunderstand each other across cultural difference and religious difference and racial difference, because we have a difficult history and because we've developed separately and we use different terminology and so on. But we have to try very hard to understand that at heart and core, the best of one another. Just as we do in interpersonal relationships, we need to do it between the races and between the religions and between the cultures. Because in the heart of God, there is no such barrier. That's the claim. So that is the end of the presentation now.